Thanks so much for being here. My name is Eliza Lustig. I'm on the National Climate Assessment Team with the U.S. Global Change Research Program, or USGCRP. Before we get started, I want to draw your attention to a note that is in the chat, or that will be in the chat shortly. Audio, or I should say microphones, are disabled for all participants. So if you have a question or if you have a comment throughout today's session, please note that in the chat box. And we're going to get to questions at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties, please contact Tia Biggs, who is our technical support person today. And then please note that all participants are expected to be respectful and considerate towards one another per the USGCRP Code of Conduct. Okay. And Tia, if you wouldn't mind popping that note in the chat when you can, that would be great. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to kick off our webinar with some background information about the National Climate Assessment before turning it over to our Social Systems and Justice chapter authors for the remainder of the presentation. Next slide. Okay, so the U.S. Global Change Research Program was mandated by Congress in the Global Change Research Act of 1990 to do as it says on the slide, which is to assist the nation and the world to understand, assess, predict, and respond to human-induced and natural processes of global change. The program convenes 15 different federal agencies to advance climate change and global change science, and of course to provide useful and usable information for decision makers across a range of scales and geographies. Next slide. Okay, so the same law that established the U.S. Global Change Research Program also mandates a scientific assessment that we call the National Climate Assessment, or the NCA. And the NCA is a quadrennial report. It analyzes the effects of global change on several sectors that are listed here on the slide. They include natural environment, agriculture, energy, transportation, social systems, biodiversity, human health, and others. USGCRP is charged with assessing current trends as well as projections for the next 25 to 100 years. And the report is used by organizations and by individuals for a variety of purposes, whether it's national policy making or risk management in the private sector or local adaptation and mitigation planning. It gets used by practitioners, utility managers, educators, and so forth. The audience is really quite broad. Next slide. Thanks. Okay, so the NCA, let's get into some specifics now. The NCA authors review a large body of scientific literature from diverse information sources. They synthesize all of that information, and they examine their confidence in both what they do know, their scientific understanding, as well as what they don't know, kind of the uncertainties. So NCA5 was written by 500 authors and 200 technical contributors from every single state of the US, as well as from Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, Guam, Palau, and Micronesia. The NCA is designed to be policy relevant, so we are asking authors to distill their findings into accessible language. We're framing things around risk to people and to important resources, but the report is strictly not policy prescriptive. We are not advocating for particular viewpoints or policy measures. To that end, we're using a range of future projections anytime we're talking about the future to help decision makers understand the fullest extent of possible risk that could be avoided or reduced under different scenarios. And so we are leaving it up to the decision maker to ultimately determine their risk threshold. Next, the report is fully compliant with all applicable federal laws and policies. That includes the Global Change Research Act, which I mentioned before. It also includes other laws that govern things like information quality and accessibility and transparency. And then finally, the report involves an extensive review process, as I'm sure our authors would attest. And that includes several opportunities for public comment, a review by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, or NASA, and several government science reviews. Next slide. Okay, so this is the NCA5 table of contents. It is vast, and like previous national climate assessments, NCA5 covers national topics as well as regions and response actions. So the report opens with an overview chapter, and that's followed by 2 chapters dedicated to the physical science of climate change. Then we get into the national topic chapters, including, for the first time ever, a new chapter dedicated to economics, as well as, of course, a chapter dedicated to social systems and justice. We then have 10 regional chapters and 2 response chapters, although it's important to note that response actions are also discussed throughout the report. They're not just sort of separated out into these 2 standalones. This table of contents has evolved quite a bit over time among NCAs, and that's been in part informed by user input. So like I said, we added those 2 new chapters. We also added 5 new focus features. So we have one on compound extreme events, one on Western wildfire, we have one on COVID-19, on supply chains, and on blue carbon. And those topics were actually elected by the authors, which is great. We also have several appendices, including one new one dedicated to indicators. Okay, so now that we've gone through some introductory background, it is my pleasure to introduce Beth Marino, the chapter lead of the Social Systems and Justice chapter. And Beth will take us through the remainder of the webinar today, along with some of her fellow co-authors. So thank you all.
Thanks. Next slide. Okay, so thank you all very much for joining us today. Thank you to Eliza and the USGCRP for that introduction to the National Climate Assessment. As Eliza said, my name is Elizabeth Marino. I was the lead author of this chapter, and I'm an associate professor of anthropology and sustainability at Oregon State University at the Cascades campus in Bend. And I'm going to give you a summary today of this chapter, the Social Systems and Justice chapter. It's chapter 20. And joining me today are authors Fayola Jacobs and Alessandra Gerollerman. They're going to chime in and talk through some of their contributions to the chapter. Beth Fussell is another author on our chapter. She's also with us today, as is our federal coordinating lead author, Keely Maxwell, and they're going to be available to answer questions at the end of this session. Before I jump into our key messages, which are incredibly important and we're going to spend a lot of time on, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our approach to the chapter. As Eliza said, we are a new chapter this year in the National Climate Assessment, and that meant that while the charge for other chapters was really to update the state of the science from the last time the NCA was published, we were asked to outline for the first time where and how the social sciences had contributed to the science of climate change as a whole. And this was, as you might imagine, a unique and an intimidating task. The social sciences, of course, are a complex set of diverse methods, literatures, and theoretical insights, and choosing what to highlight, what to leave out, and at what scale of complexity to present in this public-facing report and document was really difficult. We knew that one expectation from our chapter is that we would highlight ways in which climate risks and climate harms are distributed inequitably across populations. This has been part of the social science literature on disasters for about 50 years and is a central part of the social science of climate change. And recently, this idea of the inequitable distribution of risk has really broadly entered into the public discourse on climate change. And I can see that in popular press articles about climate change, for example. But for the National Climate Assessment and for myself and our other authors, this fact of inequitable distribution of harm, we didn't want to just state it without unpacking what that means, right? What are the mechanisms, the drivers, and the long-term outcomes of that inequitable distribution? It can feel like very often the impacts of climate change are discussed as examples of why one should care about carbon emissions or as a description of an unfortunate reality. But the social science of climate change, really writ large, has been working towards observations and descriptions of those mechanisms and social arrangements within society that drive climate change, that prevent or encourage solutions making, that describe how we do things like talk and communicate about information about climate, and what governance structures move risk through neighborhoods and households in predictable patterns. And those descriptions of social conditions and social variables are extremely complex. One example that Fayola is going to discuss later on in this presentation is about climate change and migration. And Beth Fussell, who's here with us today, is a demographer and was an important author on that section. So you can ask her questions about it if it comes up later in the question and answer session. But we often hear about migration as a result of sea level rise. And this correlation, sea level rise and migration, is mentioned throughout the National Climate Assessment. But we think it's important in the social science chapters and in the social systems chapter, and the fact that it's in the social sciences, in disciplines like demography, anthropology, and sociology, that that we're documenting not just a simple story of a storm, flooding, and then the permanent movement of people. Instead, we're observing and tracking how things like hazard mitigation infrastructure, housing availability, family network distribution, economic opportunities, and insurance rates, among other many different social variables, that these are the things that create patterns of migration in and out of cities after a flood, and that those variables are the things that create the inequitable distribution of harm. And I give you this example just to say that more than just making the point that climate change risk is inequitably distributed, we wanted to give readers an understanding of the social scaffolding in which this thing we call climate change emerges. We wanted to point to the narratives that we use to talk about it, again, point to how risk and opportunity are moved around, and to talk about what are the social organizations in which solutions have the potential to be creative, even to be reflective on the role of the National Climate Assessment. What are our assumptions about what this document is and where it's going? And that, if you're not used to thinking about things in those terms, can be like this slide, right? This is a particularly popular metaphor in anthropology. It can be like describing water to a fish. It's describing the worlds that we are all in the middle of. But that was our goal, I think, to bring the science that describes this incredible complexity of social life into the National Climate Assessment. So I just wanted to say that right off the bat to give you a little kind of peek behind the curtains to think about what we use to determine what kinds of literatures, data, empirical evidence to include and what to leave out of our chapter. Okay, so now let's jump in. Our first key message slide was about, again, the inequitable creation and distribution of climate risk. And we had 5 confidence statements associated with this key message. The first is that social systems are changing the climate. This is a slight variation from the statement that we might often hear that humans are changing the climate. And this slight variation is an acknowledgement that it's not all humans equally contributing to climate change, but that different social arrangements have different climate impacts. Our second and third statement are that social characteristics and processes shape greenhouse gas emissions through the burning of fossil fuels, and that benefits of these emissions are inequitably distributed. We leaned really heavily on the drivers literature for this section, and we outlined social processes of things like world economic integration, economic growth, population dynamics, even things like gender equity and the presence or absence of a strong environmental civil service, that all of these things affect emission levels. And we also made references here to a set of literatures that document societies which achieve high levels of human well-being, things like increased average life expectancy or perceived high quality of life, without consuming substantial amounts of fossil fuels per capita. That's a really interesting literature that we make a nod to. Our last 2 confidence statements in this key message are that governance is the critical process that distributes impacts of climate change, and that governance is a process which provides access to adaptation possibilities. So here's where we cite the literature that demonstrates in the United States, Black and BIPOC individuals and communities, members of low-income households, immigrants with limited English proficiency, unhoused individuals, rural communities, and agricultural workers are all disproportionately impacted by environmental hazards and climate change. Alessandra is going to talk through our governance figure later, but in this section, we highlighted how these inequities become particularly acute during disaster events. And it's interesting, sometimes these inequities, and again, this is a central part of our chapter, can have serious long-term consequences, but they can have relatively mundane beginnings. An example we use is that Hurricanes Maria and Harvey had measurably disproportionate negative impacts on minoritized households, renters, and low-income homes. But it's in part because just the application and appeals process for disaster assistance required documentation that some residents didn't have, or required the navigation of a very complex disaster aid structure that some communities and people were just not able to find their way through. The outcomes were then that some families and communities struggled to both meet basic needs and then were unable to access funding for long-term rebuilding. We know from previous disaster studies that it's these kinds of obstacles to recovery that can actually have long-term generational effects related to things like loss of savings, housing insecurity, and displacement. Another example we highlighted in this section is how governance structures influence the capacity for a household or a community to stay resilient during disasters through their ability or inability to access hazard mitigation funds. So these are things like seawalls or raising a house. Our example here was that the use of cost benefit tools that are used to identify, where hazard mitigation funding should go, often give priority to areas of denser population or higher value housing stock. This means that rural and low value houses are often left more at risk. Again, this is just an observation of how these governance processes can predict the distribution of risk. We also point out in this section that governance is complex and that research into public policy and political science identify a key research question here to be how quickly can the policy world and can policy react to changing climate circumstances within the legislative process. We end this key message with a really awesome example from Tulsa, Oklahoma, where a novel group of citizens and government entities came together and improved resilience to flooding in their community. So this is an example of just maybe best practices going forward. Okay, Fayola, I'll leave the next two key messages to you.
Thank you so much. Next slide, please. Oh, I should say, I'm Fayola Jacobs. I'm an assistant professor of urban planning at the University of Minnesota, and so honored to be on this webinar today. So our key message number 2 is social systems structure how people know and communicate about climate change. And so the first statement is people's histories, educations, cultures, and ethics determine how they understand and experience climate change. And so this is an important point, especially when we think about the concept of epistemology, which is how do we know what we know? And so across climate change, there are many ways that many different people know what they know about the climate changing. So physical scientists, such as the ones on the NCA5, may know what they know through statistical models where they model climate impacts. Social scientists, such as us, may trust quantitative and qualitative analyses of human behavior, interactions, and social systems. And then we have some fishers, farmers, and hunters may trust their lived experiences and track changes in their observations of ocean currents, plant and animal behavior, and such to understand climate change. I personally used to be able to tell the time of year by when my mother in the Caribbean said her mango trees were bearing, usually in June and July. And so one of the ways that I know that climate change is happening is through the unpredictable growth seasons of mangoes now. And so physical scientists, the next statement says these knowledges take multiple forms and generate diverse approaches to climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. And one of the important points about this is that these approaches, the approaches of the physical scientists, social scientists, and fishers, farmers, and hunters, do not have to be in conflict with each other. Rather, they are painting a more holistic picture of what's happening as our world changes, and also pointing to diverse areas in which we can intervene. So we're talking about decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, increasing access of disadvantaged populations to alternative energy sources, and dismantling inequitable systems. And one of the things that can be so key in really taking into account all these multiple forms of knowledge is the process of co-production and co-creation with respect to research and implemented outcomes. Beth will talk a little bit about co-production and co-creation with one of the figures we'll talk about later. And so to dive into some of the social psychological literature, we understand that engagement across community that builds clear objectives and benchmarks has been shown to produce more desired outcomes, that even effective engagement is challenging due in part to the complexity and uncertainty associated with climate change and politics, and that including community perspectives and multiple forms of knowledge in climate discussions and decision-making helps promote justice. And so what this means is that it does not only matter what we are communicating, aka the basis of the message, but it also matters how we're communicating, in what forms, in what languages, using what tones we're communicating, as well as who the messengers are. So there is a lot of mistrust of communities such as low-income communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities in what we understand to be official sources. We see this all the time in disasters and communication about pending disasters, pending hurricanes, who people trust based on their favorite radio announcer to official newspaper announcements. And so one of the things we really want to take into account is the way that the information is communicated and who is communicating it, and making sure that we are communicating to disadvantaged populations, especially in ways that they trust, understand, and make sense to them. And so can we go to the next slide, please? And so our key message number 3 is that climate justice is possible if processes like migration and energy transitions are equitable. One of the things that we know from the literature is that climate migration is a very, very complicated process, but it is a process that will likely affect a lot of us, as 20% of the US population is threatened by tropical storms and hurricanes, and they cause billions of dollars in damage with each storm. Now, there's not enough known about what climate change related disaster migration might look like, just because it's not yet a major driver of migration. But we do know a lot about disaster migration due to researchers that have been doing this work for decades. So one of the things that we do know is most counties only deviate temporarily from pre-disaster growth trends after a hurricane or storm. We also know that despite the fact that this pre-disaster growth trends continues, demographic composition of the place might change. And right now, climate change models are really predicting more gradual but uneven impacts on population. And so one of the ways that we think about migration, and one of the things that we know about migration following a disaster, is that rental properties, which house a disproportionate number of low-income and BIPOC households, are built so much more slowly than owner-occupied housing. We see this time and time again, which drives up rents and limits the number of affordable rental units. And so while we see more residential mobility observed around renters and those lacking clear title, as Beth discussed earlier, we also see an upheaval in housing markets after disasters because of evictions and gentrifications as real estate speculators buy deeply discounted properties for development. And so one of the things that's important to think about in these disasters is that we often turn to the tool of buyouts, where governments will pay communities market rate usually for them to move out of their current household and move to more less hazard exposed places. But with buyouts, there are lots of issues with trust and lack of transparency. Research has shown that these buyouts are often pursued in high property value counties, but in BIPOC neighborhoods within the high property value counties. And so they're used as a tool, they're seen as used as a tool to displace lower income residents in higher wealth neighborhoods. And so that brings us to just transition. So really thinking about the concept of just transition comes out of 1970s labor environmentalism. Specifically, people were thinking a lot about how to make sure workers in fossil fuel industries are ensured work in the new world as we shift away from fossil fuels. And so recently it's been broadened to really think about mitigating and adapting to climate change in a managed way that ensures equitable access, not just to jobs, but to environmental goods and quality of life. Migration will be a part of this just transition, we think, and we will have to manage buyouts, manage retreats from hazard exposed areas to make sure that they're equitable and just. As we're all coming into this world, as this is a new these are new situations that we're entering into. There aren't necessarily a whole lot of models of what a just transition looks like, but one of the areas that our chapter looked at is green infrastructure. So really thinking about green infrastructure that helps mitigate some of the flooding issues, as well as dealing with overheating issues in neighborhoods, and really on the small scale, thinking about the application of equity indices to guide its installation and maintenance as small scale examples of what this could look like with some success. And I'll turn it over to the next person.
Okay, slide. Now we're going to walk you through some of the figures that we used in our chapter. And our first figure describes the three characteristics of environmental justice. That was a notion originally summarized by Robert Bullard in the 1990s. It's both important framework for understanding both environmental and climate justice as we move through our chapter. It was also a nod to the roots of some of the work that we've all participated in and the inspiration that Dr. Bullard provided. So he's sometimes called the father of environmental justice. And we wanted to acknowledge that many of the ideas in our chapter aren't new, right? These are ideas that have been around for a long time. The three arms of environmental justice that we worked with are distributional justice, recognitional justice, and procedural justice. So distributional justice is mostly about making sure the benefits and burdens of any environmental decision or decision that has an environmental impact are distributed equitably. Recognitional justice is about recognizing the people who are harmed by environmental decision making and taking their thoughts, concerns, and histories seriously as we talk about these issues. Procedural justice is about making sure that overburdened and affected communities are part of the decision-making process. Next slide. Now we're going to talk about this complex idea of governance, and I'm going to let Alessandra walk you through this figure.
Hi, I'm Alessandra Girolamo. I'm the Director of Research at Loyola University New Orleans College of Law's Center on Environment, Land, and Law. And before talking about this figure, I just wanted to take a minute to give you the definition of governance that we used in the chapter. Governance is defined as the processes and structures that steer society and the multiplicity of actors who are involved. Institutional arrangements of governance comprise the set of rules, norms, and shared practices that underlie decision-making. This definition comes from political science and public administration literature, as well as some planning literature that really speaks to how it is that these different processes interact in different policy spheres. This graphic is intended to show the complex interaction of multiple social systems that give rise to governance. Climate change impacts and the impacts of adaptation and mitigation strategies will all be mediated by governance decisions and actions. Understanding this complex interplay allows the social scientists who study climate change to make predictions regarding climate impacts and to assess where governance systems are expected to produce climate justice or injustice. And so in order to sort of give an example in this figure, we focused on the impacts from and even the extent of flooding. And I'll sort of walk through how these 7 different areas can come into play. First, and in no particular order, institutions, which you see at the bottom of the figure. Institutions such as the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and its state, county, and city equivalents have a large impact on pre- and post-disaster experiences with regards to something such as flooding. They're involved in setting standards, for example, for floodplain management, making insurance available, involved directly in decisions around disaster recovery and resourcing, involved in adaptation measures, involved in where structures, such as homes, businesses, and federal buildings are situated. Second, civil society actors also play a role. For example, nonprofit organizations and local advocacy groups provide post-disaster resources and make policy recommendations for things such as hazard mitigation actions like buyouts that were mentioned earlier. Groups include the Association of State Floodplain Managers, ASFPM, the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, or IBHS, and the Anthropocene Alliance, among many, many more, including some that are hyper-local and focused on particular events, as well as national and even international, in some cases, groups. Third, you have public processes. Things such as hazard mitigation planning and post-disaster recovery planning include extensive public engagement requirements. The National Climate Assessment, as was previously discussed, is also one such process. So are adaptation plans at the local and state levels, climate action plans, master plans for different coastlines, and many other processes that are impacting what's happening at the local level. Some states are engaging in equity action plans as well. Fourth, laws and regulations. For example, floodplain management ordinances might be used for climate adaptation, and laws such as the Stafford Act govern disaster response. These laws and regulations exist at the local, state, and federal levels and interact and interplay with each other in many different and complex ways. Fifth, litigation. Legal challenges sometimes arise to zoning ordinances, for example, in the ways in which development, or the National Flood Insurance Program, disaster recovery. Litigation can arise between individuals, can also include challenges to agency actions. Sixth, budgeting. For example, matching and benefit cost requirements can determine where climate adaptation must be spent. In addition to large-scale budgeting processes that happen at federal, local, and state levels, varied levels of public involvement, there are also particular decisions around who pays for climate adaptation actions that can mediate who can afford to adapt, who can afford to live in a place once regulations require it to be safer. And finally, norms. For example, the rights of individual property owners in the United States are considered a very important set of rights. Sometimes this can limit collective responses to climate change. Other norms include valuing slab homes as a particular type of housing as opposed to elevated homes. And next slide, please.
Okay, so this is our slide about co-production. Fayola mentioned that we talked about co-production. A kind of quick way to think about it is how to have scientists play better with others. This figure was adapted from a 2017 article from Bremer and Misch. And co-production most broadly, like I said, is how scientists can play better with others, but it's also how science can better integrate with other social phenomena. That includes institutions and non-scientific communities. So first, science can be more formally integrated into institutions, such as governance institutions. Science can work better with non-scientists or other members of the public in order for the findings to be more relevant to really on-the-ground situations. That kind of co-production of science is more likely often to use insights from the ground to influence methods, for example, and it allows for the option of building social learning into the scientific process itself. Another important aspect to co-production, and then one that we touch on in our chapter, is the potential for science to integrate with other epistemological systems. And what we mean by that is for science to integrate with other ways of knowing. Co-produced research has been interested in how science and indigenous knowledge systems, for example, can share insights and observations. How this integration of science can happen within other institutions and communities and ways of knowing, this can affect how we see things. Even like nature itself is part of this figure. It can change how we articulate the problem of climate change and how we move from knowledge of climate change to solutions to climate change. And this is captured in the two descriptive lenses highlighted in the upper right of this figure. The other important point to this figure is to show that co-production is an unwieldy term. For the scientists that are listening in, you might understand and know and see that lots of people are using the term co-production right now, but it can be difficult to measure and difficult to measure its efficacy when it lacks a clear definition. So we also wanted to highlight here that the various ways it's possible to define something like co-production and the importance of definition as we move forward and use terms like this to think about this integration of science into a wider community. Okay, next slide. This is our fourth figure, and I think that we get the award for simplest figure in the NCA for this one. It is quite straightforward. These are lessons, particularly from the social psychological literature on climate communication, and they are well measured and infrequently employed. So we wanted educators and scientists and the public to just have a figure you could cut out and pin above your desk to remind you that if you want to engage with the public about climate change or climate science, it's better to do these three things. communities to set clear benchmarks, identify stakeholders, tailor messaging and content for those groups, and then iteratively revisit that cycle. And that's a better way to make these conversations happen. Okay, next slide. Again, this is our figure on migration. And we're really trying to bring the social life of climate migration into the foreground here. Migration as a result of environmental disruptions can be just or unjust. They have happened in the past, they're happening currently, and they can happen and they will happen in the future. This figure can really be read from any point, starting at any point on this in the figure. Temporally, it's circular, not linear, but I'm going to start at the left. So conditions on the ground are either the case that there's an equitable distribution of risk or an inequitable distribution of risk. In our figure, we note that contemporarily, histories of settler colonialism and other racialized patterns of ownership have created a circumstance in which there is an inequitable distribution of risk today. And then moving to the right, you have an environmental disruption, and that will affect people in the places that they live. And within this background context of just or unjust governance, these disruptions may cause migration. That migration will again result in just or unjust relocation processes. An unjust relocation process would play out when people are not included in the decision-making, when there is an increased risk to their well-being that happens as a result of these relocations, if they experience homelessness or social disarticulation as an example, or if social networks break down. Then following that unjust relocation, individuals or communities may reemerge at the beginning of the figure within a social context of inequitable distribution of risk. Or we can hopefully see migration as a just relocation process, or something that may result in a just relocation process. Just relocations could mean that relocating communities are empowered to relocate using their own social values and norms. It could mean that social and economic conditions improve and risk decreases, for example. A just relocation process results in the reemergence of communities in more equitable conditions at the end of the relocation process. And of course, the backdrop to this this orange and blue differentiation in our figure here is just or unjust governance, linked to that complex understanding of governance that Alessandra just outlined for us. Next slide. And finally, our chapter ends with an example of climate relocation that's being carried out by the Quinault Indian Nation. This example is very brief, but it highlights how relocation can be driven and can happen within tribal sovereignty and can respect the authority of the community engaged in that relocation. One thing we were proud of in our chapter is that we did this, that we didn't just use this example without consulting the tribe. So as a kind of, walking the walk, we held an informational session with the Quinault Tribal Council, discussed what our chapter, why our chapter wanted to use this case study, what the NCA was and how it would be used. And we discussed with them what information we would use to outline the nuances of that case study. Then there was a formal vote by the Tribal Council, and they agreed to let us use this example in the chapter. Following that, the chapter received the photo you see here from the Tribal Council, again, with all the appropriate approvals. And a shout out, this was organized by an author on our chapter named Melissa Shutton, and we were really grateful to her for her insights on tribal consultation and for helping us carry out this important permission gathering process. Okay, so that is our formal presentation today. And I'm really thankful for all of you that stayed tuned until the end, and we're happy to take questions. And just really quickly, an important slide. These are all the many people who contributed to our chapter, and we needed them all. There was a diverse group of social scientists, and they really provided insight and wisdom in ways that were expected and unexpected. So just a real thank you to all of the authors that participated in this chapter.